Hi, good afternoon. Welcome to Colonized Minds, the podcast. This is Elizabeth Guzman Arroyo.
And this is Luke Givens.
And today, what are we talking about, Luke?
I think there's so much we could talk about. I think maybe we're going to talk about DACA. That seems to be kind of a big thing right now. Or we could talk about just kind of the current climate right now. Which way you want to go with this?
Well, I think the current climate is kind of different at each campus.
It is.
Do we want to talk about specifically Cascade?
Well, we can talk about that. I think I meant when I said that just kind of more the overall climate. I think people feel very differently than they did on November 7th.
Right.
Well, some people feel very differently than they did on November 7th. But yeah, it just seems like I think just out there and whatever there is, people feel there's a lot of stuff going on. Maybe that's an easier way to say it.
Well, at this point, I think we can talk about what's going on. So if you've heard our past podcasts, we haven't necessarily talked a lot about the presidential elections because honestly, we can't.
Yeah.
Because since we're public employees, we have to be bipartisan.
Yeah.
But now that the election has happened, we can talk about like what happens afterwards.
Yes.
Right?
Yes, we can.
So there's definitely been a lot of students and a lot of community members that have stopped by our office specifically and expressed different feelings of, honestly, fear.
Yeah. And
so do we want to dive a little bit deeper into that?
Let's dive deeper into that. I think you hit on this really interesting thing there. There does seem to be a lot of fear. And I think a lot of that fear is, it seems like some of it is very much based in uncertainty and not knowing what's going to happen.
Right.
But I think there's just that old saying, like when someone shows you who they are, believe them. So there's also this feeling like there's been a lot of rhetoric that's been out there during the campaign that has caused people to be very fearful. So it's not necessarily for them uncertainty. It's, certain things have been said, and so they think that those things are going to be delivered on. And if those things are delivered on, it has a direct impact on their life.
Right.
I know there's a lot of times people like to, especially during elections, like to say, well, president isn't necessarily a figurehead. They're not really that important. They don't really do a whole lot. So there's a lot of stuff like that gets said, or only focus on local politics, which is something we've said that you should focus on local politics. But there is a lot actually that the president does do. And so I think because there is some power that the president in that position does wield, there are some people who are quite fearful right now.
Right. President-elect Donald Trump has stated multiple times that he wants to get rid of DACA.
Yeah.
Right. And for those that don't know what DACA is Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, which essentially it's an American immigration policy passed by President Obama as an executive action that allowed certain undocumented immigrants to the United States who entered the country before their 16th birthday and before June 2007 to receive a renewable 2-year permit. And are able to stay here.
Yeah, and I think that's really important to specify that because this is, again, something that gets lost in the rhetoric that gets thrown out there, right? There's this picture, I think, that's painted of people who are undocumented. And one of the things that's important about DACA is that we are talking about individuals who were brought to the country before they were the age of 16.
Right.
That is... If we're dealing in facts, that is specifically who it applies to, is individuals who were brought, keyword, to this country before the age of 16, and individuals who have no criminal records, no criminal history. Mm-hmm. So by all intents and purposes, they are just as fine, upstanding human beings as anyone who was born here.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and oftentimes with folks who have DACA or who have applied for DACA, I mean, we're brought here at like age 2, age 4, etc. It's like you're saying that word that you've been referencing, like we're brought here. Yeah. It wasn't a choice made by oneself.
Yeah, and I know, and I also say that not saying like, okay, well, there's something that individuals' parents are bad. we can have a philosophical debate about parents making the decision to bring children here. Like, and that's a conversation I'll have with someone like till the cows come home of why an individual or a family decides to do that. But I think it's important when this rhetoric kind of gets fired up and we start using the word like illegal and those types of things, that a child who is not 16 can't commit a crime. Like, you are criminalizing an individual who is not an adult yet, they didn't make that decision for themselves.
Right.
And I think that's like a really important thing that gets brought to the surface. Of all folks, Jeb Bush made this point in one of the debates, like, we're not monsters, right? The idea is that we don't want to rip apart families. And you are talking about individuals who, circumstances what brought them here, and this is the only home many of them have ever known.
Yeah.
And so the idea somehow of deporting those individuals from really what is their home, you got to question that, like, if that's the type of person that you want to be, if that's the type of country that you want to have.
Yeah.
The DACA conversation I think is really interesting. And I think it's interesting because there is so much uncertainty going on right now around DACA, because you have so many folks who've actually applied for it, who've been granted it, and they're now just kind of in this place where it's like, I don't know what I'm going to do. So for a person who maybe hasn't applied yet, I think from everything that we're hearing, it sounds like the advice, the recommendations, from whether it's Northwest immigration rights or whether it's national immigration law, it seems like most of the folks are saying, if you haven't applied yet, you probably should wait. So you should wait until after the inauguration, so that way we can get some consistency to figure out what we're going to do. But it sounds like a lot of those same people are saying, if you already have DACA, and this sounds weird, and you're up for renewal, like, hey, what's the worst? Like, basically, what's the worst that's going to happen? Like, they already have your information, so
right.
You might as well. I think it's important that we talk about that and that we address it, because this actually has a direct impact on not just how you and I do our job, but I think all of us in this community, how we're doing our job. I know there's people who like to separate like politics and education, social issues in education, and maybe they don't necessarily understand why people are so upset, but this is actually going to have a direct impact on who is going to be in your classroom. Like, it's going to have a direct impact in who's going to come to your counter, right? Like, if you are seriously going to use resources to deport the millions of folks who have DACA right now, you have to believe, you have to understand that is going to have a significant impact on what our campus community looks like, regardless of what it feels like. That's going to have a huge impact on who it is actually in the seats.
From what I know from my sources in those areas.
This sounds like a Fox Mulder talking to the it's like X-Files.
From my sources, folks who have DACA or who have, essentially registered with DACA are actually the safest right now from deportation.
Well, yeah, everything that I've looked at and read has essentially said that the priority is going to be, as far as deportation is concerned, is going to be people who've committed violent crimes, people who are in some way connected to organized crime, whether it's gangs or some other type of organized crime organization. So those are the individuals that it sounds like people are going to go after first. So if you have DACA, there's that argument that you've already been vetted by the federal government. They've dug into your past. They know what your history is like, and so they've said that you are not a threat to national security. Mm-hmm. So that person is a bit safer. But there is, to get into kind of conspiracy theories, or maybe not so conspiracy theories, there is that very real concern that the federal government now has all of my information, and that is information that they didn't have before I applied for DACA.
Yeah.
So when I might have been undocumented and I was here and I was paying cash and I was, I wasn't necessarily quote unquote like on the grid, and I wasn't necessarily as public as I am now, right? Where now they know where I stay. They know who's in my family. So I guess it means that you've got to put a pretty good bit of trust continue putting a pretty good bit of trust into the federal government and for it to work the right way.
So, and this is for our students and for other staff and faculty that have direct contact with students. It's just some information for DACA students on funding your education. It was actually put together by a colleague of mine, Araceli Cruz, who works out of Lewis and Clark College in financial aid. And essentially, she put 5 different points together of information for DACA students. One being that undocumented students in Oregon are eligible for state aid. And so filling out the Oregon Student Aid Application, ORSA, is one of the steps. That and then Oregon Promise is also eligible for undocumented students. And so whether you have DACA or not, you can access those funds. And then one of the other big things that she put on here was that in Oregon, we actually have several organizations that donate scholarships and grants to students in general, regardless of documented status. And so a couple of those are the Ford Family Foundation, the Hispanic Scholarship Fund, Hispanic Metropolitan Chamber of Commerce, and the Jack Kent Cook Foundation.
Cool.
But now for our staff and faculty, like how do you address this in the classroom when you have students coming in who have that real fear?
So I think one of the things that I would encourage folks to do, there's actually a really good blog out there called My Undocumented Life. It's actually something I was looking at before all of this happened, but I think there's a lot of great information on that particular blog. And so I would encourage folks to one, I think, to look at that, but also try to create a space in your class to hold some of these dialogues. And I know some of that is already being done. I actually was talking to a few of my colleagues yesterday, and some of them said, it was 15 minutes that we took at the beginning of class to have this conversation. And some said, yeah, we didn't know how long it was going to take, but it ended up taking the whole class. And there was folks crying and folks hugging and folks yelling and then, coming back together. But essentially what they did was, they kind of suspended things for a little bit and said, all right, let's engage in this dialogue. Let's actually have this dialogue. And they found that it was incredibly constructive. We try to be logical a lot of times, but let's actually think about the logic here. There are people who are incredibly emotionally charged right now. And now that person is sitting down in a classroom and they're trying to pay attention. And yeah, for you, this could be like an election. You may not think twice about it. You may feel like I'm not affected anyway about this, but there are some people who very much are going to be affected. And so just being able to take that little bit of time during class or during your meeting to process that and talk about that in a constructive way, I think can be incredibly important. And if nothing else, if it is done in a constructive way, I think what that communicates to those students is that this is a place where, we actually care.
Right.
As opposed to what I think oftentimes happen, which is, I'm uncomfortable. I don't know what to say. Go to the multicultural center. Right.
And I think you bring up a good point there about essentially sending that hidden message to students that we actually care. Because on the day post-election, Tuesday last week, or Wednesday last week, technically.
Yeah, Wednesday was post, yeah.
Wednesday last week, we actually had students come in to the MC who were, one, confused, two, concerned, and three, kind of felt like a sense of belonging was taken away.
Oh, yeah.
Not necessarily only because of the election results, but also because of the response, or more the lack of response from faculty members in the classroom. So just going straight back into class and picking up exactly at the chapter that was left off in. And the students were upset, were angry, were concerned that, something really big happened that essentially could impact their lives or their families' lives or friends' lives, and it wasn't actually being discussed in an educational setting.
Yeah, and that's strange to me. I mean, I understand it, but it's incredibly strange to me. And I like the way that you actually put that, because I think when you put it like that, it makes sense to maybe some of those individuals. Like, you had something that just incredibly impacted people's life, and then you went on with business as usual. Like, it's almost like saying what you're communicating is like, well, something is wrong with you because you're affected by this. Well, like, of course I'm going to be affected by this. Like, this was a pretty substantial thing. Sometimes the most important thing to do is just acknowledge that something has happened, right? And regardless of what side of the political spectrum you're on or who you voted for, you would have to be blind to not acknowledge that things are incredibly divisive. They are incredibly divisive because of the ways in which the campaign was run. And that's not necessarily like this candidate did this candidate did this, but this is, if you look overall, I think, at the election process and how it's unfolded. And I think parties own some responsibility. I think candidates own some responsibility. I think our media and news agencies, in the ways in which they've reported information and presented information, owe some responsibility. And I also think us, as I'm using citizens, but not citizens in the actual technical term, but people who inhabit this country, I think we owe a degree of responsibility for that. We've played into that. So whether you agree with the individual candidates themselves or not, what has been created is this incredibly divisive atmosphere. There's a group of people who feel like somehow they won, and now there's a group of people who feel like they've lost, and not lost an election, but lost in many ways like a future.
Yeah. I think you put it in perfect terms there about feeling like a future has been lost. It's definitely how our students and our community members are feeling, some of them.
I think the other thing is that there's also a feeling of, for a lot of people, like a feeling of disappointment. And just kind of follow me on this. Like, there's like a feeling like you were sold out, I think, for a lot of people. And what I mean by that is, when we talk about the idea of like a future, there's a feeling that there's a part of our country that somehow believes that in order for this other part of America to have a future, something has to be taken from them. And there's this feeling that like that was played up, and that people were led to somehow believe that, you know, you have to take something from someone else in order to advance. And even if I won't say even if that's not the case, that's not the actual case. And so I think for a lot of those people who had no intention of taking anything away from someone, they didn't want to take from anybody. They wanted to be able to participate in this kind of American dream, right? And they wanted that fair shake. Those people now, I think, are a bit disappointed that people were led to believe, and they bought into the idea that somehow, in order for them to get ahead, they had to take something away from someone else.
Yeah.
And ultimately, on that other side there, yeah, you are talking about now taking something away from an individual, right? And taking something away from groups, because there's a future that is incredibly uncertain for those individuals. Oh, you got this look like you want to say something. We can always edit it out.
I was thinking about those safety pins.
Oh, yeah. Say more.
So there's a movement going on right now in our country that actually takes after Brexit.
Yeah.
Brexit, sorry. A movement that takes after Brexit, and essentially it's folks putting safety pins on their person to essentially signify like I'm an ally in a sense. I really hate those safety pins.
Yeah. Okay. So we look at that the same way. I could care less about like your safety pins.
Right.
Yeah.
Because to me, the safety pins is just like you're not actually doing anything. You're not actually creating real change.
But it's building awareness.
It's like a safe way of like saying I'm an ally.
But isn't that what we want though? Like I say this all the time. Like everyone wants change, but no one wants to actually do it.
Right.
Like they want change, but they don't want to actually have to be the one who does something. So we love stuff that make us like feel important and yet safe. So like, oh, I can put on a safety pin. I don't have to do anything else, but I can put on this safety pin so I can show solidarity. But I don't really want to do anything else.
Right. To me, it's kind of like the same thing as I can put on that pink ribbon or that red little ribbon, right,
Yeah.
for like cancer awareness or AIDS
AIDS
awareness,
yeah.
but not actually like donate money, not actually do anything besides wear that pin for a day.
Yes.
What am I really saying? Oh, I'm informed that this is happening. That's too bad for you.
Yeah, and ultimately that's what it is. Like, oh yeah, I know about this thing. But yeah, when it comes down to it, what am I actually doing? I'm not saying, that said, I'm not saying like you need to go out and you need to march. I'm not saying like that can look a lot of different ways, but the idea that somehow you can just wear like a safety pin, like that's one of those things, like that's for you. That's not for me.
Right.
And I think that's important to acknowledge, right?
To me, it's false generosity.
It absolutely is false generosity. But I think that's important to acknowledge. And I run into this a lot doing this type of work, is that you have people who almost think that they are doing you a favor by being there. And it's like, no, this is making you feel good, right? You get to pat yourself on the back, or you get to flog yourself and like get some sense of catharsis out of this. But you aren't actually being helpful. Like, you aren't actually doing anything. Like, until you're willing to put yourself in a place of discomfort, you're just making yourself feel good and patting yourself on the back.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
There are mixed responses to it. Some people really like the idea of essentially, let's say you're being like harassed or like verbally harassed or something on like the bus, and you're able to look around and see people who are wearing safety pins and like kind of tap them as being allies, or at least that's what I've heard.
I was going to say, here's the flaw in that. So the flaw in that is, if you are being harassed on the bus and you see people with safety pins and those individuals haven't stepped in and done something already, the idea of the safety pin is inherently flawed. It's not doing what it's supposed to do. Right.
No, and trust me, that's my view on it too. Yeah. But I've heard several people essentially make this correlation. To me, I honestly think that folks who make a strong argument for the safety pins, it's more of a comfort thing. Yeah. It's more about not necessarily only the folks who are wearing the safety pins being comfortable, right, and being allies or in their allyship. Yeah. But also for the folks who come from marginalized communities, a sense of comfort knowing that like different people are wearing these safety pins, right? But in a sense, it's almost like this fake safety. If all the sexism and the racism and the xenophobia and the homophobia, etc., didn't already exist before this election, like if that sort of stuff didn't already exist, but it did.
Yeah, so that's actually a great point to make too, because I also think there's this degree of like realism. I don't know if you watch Saturday Night Live at all. I tend to watch it. Dave Chappelle was on there, and he and Chris Rock did this great skit. And the premise of the skit is funny because we were actually talking about this. Is like this surprise, right? This surprise, and the people that they were watching the election results with were like so in shock at the result. And the whole night he's kind of like, essentially alluding to like, I don't think this is going to go the way that you think it's going to go. Like, are you really so sure of yourself? Like, you know what I compare it to? It's like the Ferguson emails. Like, for the first time, it's like you have people of color and you have folks who have been saying for years, you've had student-led research that said, this has been my experience in the class. This has been my experience here. And that stuff has not been like, oh, those are isolated incidents. That's not important. That doesn't exist here. Like, okay, well, maybe it does, but it's not that big. And then when the email goes out, people are actually able to see for the first time, like, oh, yeah, we actually have like real deal racists here. And it was the first time I think our white counterparts were able to actually see it. And they were incredibly like affected and impacted by it. I don't think you could try to tell people of color that racism just started November 9th. Right. Like, or that it just was stirred up or riled up, based on this election. Like, right, no. Like, it was there. It's been there. It hasn't gone anywhere. Look, it may have changed how it looked. Absolutely. But it was still there. So it's like, I know there's a lot of people who are getting this realism kind of for the first time, but I think for a lot of us, it's kind of like, well, yeah, of course this is here. FBI just released their the hate crime report for 2015. So just last year, right? The number one hate crime that's taken place has been based on race. 59%. So of all of the hate crimes and bias incidents that took place in 2015
In all of the United States.
in all of the United States that were reported, 59% were based on race, ethnicity, or ancestral origin. Like, I'll let that sink in.
Yeah.
So for the people who are saying, well, racism doesn't exist, or why is it that we keep talking about racism? We keep talking about racism, and we know that racism exists because even before the results of the election, the majority of the hate crimes and bias incidents that happened in this country were based on race.
Mm-hmm.
So what's that saying, like, men lie, women lie, numbers don't, right? These are what the numbers say, right? So that said, I can understand people feeling, uncomfortable and disappointed. I tend not to be disappointed by things that I can anticipate. I can expect more and I can want more, but I can't be all that shocked.
Right.
So one of the things that you're starting to see, and I think is part of the concerns, are that you are going to have people who are creating these like racially committing these racially charged like hate crimes, right? And they're going to begin attacking people. And I think you're starting to see at least some of that. Just on Friday, there was a young Muslim woman who was threatened at the University of Michigan. A guy actually threatened to set her on fire if she did not remove her headscarf. So that's in Michigan, right? But for those folks who were going like, oh, that's Michigan, that doesn't happen here. Well, guess what? At Reed College, there were 2 bathrooms that were just defaced in the library. Someone went in, spray painted swastikas, a lot of homophobic and racist stuff on the walls, and actually literally says, so if you're saying, no, this has nothing to do with the election, they spray painted the white man is back in power. So if it's hard for you to see how those things are connected, this person did you the favor of actually being able to combine those things. Mm-hmm. So for those folks who were saying that these are isolated incidents, again, you've said this before, people in the dominant group see isolated incidents. People who are part of the targeted group are able to see the patterns. We're able to see how those incidents are connected. Right. I would challenge those folks to use a degree of critical thinking and see how these isolated incidents are connected. Mm-hmm. So there's some people out there who I'm sure are kind of saying, so what do we do? What does this all mean? Well, one of the things I would encourage folks to do, and this is something we said a little bit earlier, definitely check out the mydocumentedlife.org, the blog. I think there's some really great tips and resources there. We can also say that there are some things that other colleges and universities are doing. So one of the things that people are advocating and pushing for is the idea of creating sanctuary campuses. Have you heard about this? Are you familiar with it?
I have. I've seen a couple of schools that have made statements.
Yeah, so it works in the same way as like kind of a sanctuary city, where essentially you're aligning yourself with folks who, with your undocumented students. And there's 3 ways that can look like. So one is kind of saying, ultimately what you're saying is that we're going to limit our cooperation with ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement. And that can look at a lot of different ways. So it could be information sharing. So refusing to release information about the immigration status of a particular student. There's another option that looks almost like not a trespass, but essentially saying that you are preventing ICE from actually coming on campus and conducting any type of immigration enforcement unless there's exigent circumstances, right? So there's some type of like imminent threat. Anything other than that, preventing ICE from actually enforcing immigration policy on campus. And then the third option looks at actual policy. And so this one would be, hypothetically, if it was here, only the board can pass policy. So it would look like our board actually developing a policy that says that our public safety can't act on behalf of federal agents to enforce immigration laws. So those are like some very specific things that can be done. Now, there are consequences that come with that. You could potentially in the future have federal funding revoked. So you run the risk. We are a public institution, so we run the risk of running afoul of the feds. So that is a risk that we would have to take. It would also be incredibly unpopular for folks. There's also the thought that maybe that's not something that we can enforce. If nothing else, it could be seen as symbolic. So that's at least something that individuals are doing. I'm not necessarily advocating one way or the other. I'm simply saying what other folks are doing. Another thing that a lot of folks are doing is actually creating a very specific link, a page on their websites, specifically for undocumented students, right? So partly a statement of solidarity, but then also saying, what resources are available, what's true, what's not. Also, almost listing as like an FAQs, right?
Yeah.
For folks who are undocumented. And I think regardless of the political climate, I mean, that's just something I think that's good to do anyway.
No, I totally agree. All right, so I think we're running out of time for our segment today. Are there any announcements that are coming up?
Yeah, so this is kind of a far-off announcement, but I'll go ahead and list it anyway. We just actually confirmed on November 28th from 1 to 2 o'clock in the Cascade TLC, which is Teaching and Learning Center. I believe that is Cascade Hall 102. We are going to be hosting a workshop. It is called Strategic Organizing for Transformation. We're actually going to have Mr. Brandon Lee, who's CEO of Training for Transformation. He's going to be coming in to lead a workshop on essentially how to organize for transformation. So being able to take your energy, being able to take these issues and social concerns that you may have, how do you take that and do more than just talk about it? Mm-hmm. How do you take that beyond simply wearing a safety pin to really being able to organize in an effective way that can affect policy? Brendan's actually had a pretty good bit of experience in affecting a policy in different institutions. So we thought we would bring him in to really talk and work with our students on how they can take kind of that energy that they may have around issues and use that as a way to advocate for students by affecting policy. So that's going to be November the 28th from 1 to 2 o'clock in the Cascade TLC. Okay.
Then this Wednesday on November 16th, we're actually having our PDAR, which is Purposeful Dialogues About Race. So if you want to engage in that conversation, I'm not sure exactly what the topic will be this week.
I got to guess.
You got to guess. There you go. And that will be in the TLC in Cascade Hall from 12:30 to 2 p.m.
At the same time, from 1 to 2 p.m., and I believe that's going to be in the Student Union, is Pizza with the President. So that's going to be, again, this Wednesday. What is that, November 18th? 16th, November 16th. So if you're hungry, you can go to Pizza with the President. If you have already eaten, go to PDAR. PDAR might get the hangry folks. I don't know. But that'll be going on at the same time. And I believe I got a pretty strong suspicion there's going to be some overlapping conversations.
Oh, yeah, very much so.
Yeah.
Then for next week, we're actually, if you're interested in learning a little bit more about the 13th Amendment or a lot more about the 13th Amendment, we're going to be actually showing the movie 13, which was, it's a documentary essentially created by Netflix.
Well, yeah, Ava DuVernay, who's the director of Selma.
Right. And so 13th, which will explain exactly what the 13th Amendment is and what it does and its ability to discriminate, essentially.
So for those of you who might be wondering what the 13th Amendment is, or maybe thinking like Emancipation Proclamation, freeing the slaves, well, essentially what the 13th Amendment said was that slavery was illegal unless you committed a crime. If you committed a crime, you could be in prison and essentially you could be a slave of the state. That's kind of my interpretation of it. But I would encourage you to read the actual 13th Amendment for yourself, the whole thing. Mm-hmm. But that's the topic of the documentary itself, was essentially how we went from a privatized slave system to a almost government-sponsored and government-backed slave system.
Right. And so that screening will be next Wednesday, November 23rd, in the Student Union, room 204 from 1 to 3 p.m. Again, that's next Wednesday, November 23rd, 1 to 3 p.m. in the Student Union, room 204, and food will be provided, so don't worry about lunch. All right, so this has been Elizabeth Guzman Arroyo.
This has been Luke Gibbons.
Saying, so what if it's true?